There we go. Oh, say, I asked, then he gave permission, then I had to ask again. This is like joining the army or something like that. All right, so I think we're good now. So let's just do this. Let's do it again. So we got Stephen Anderson, myself, John Goldsmith, John Joseph, Heather Newell, Sam Rosenthal, and Margaret Thomas. Okay, that's who we are. I'm going to say a little bit about history of linguistics as a path to dissertation progress and contextualization of research. John Goldsmith was going to speak on this topic about using graphical representations of characters in the history of linguistics, but he won't because he's not here. John Joseph is going to talk about presentist, trajectorial, and heliocentric approaches to teaching the history of linguistics. Sam Rosenthal is going to talk about goals for teaching history of linguistics. Margaret Thomas will talk about the history of linguistics in American college textbooks between 1950 and 2023. And our discussion will be headed by Stephen Anderson and Heather Newell. So let me just get to, and then there'll be audience Q&A. And as I said, it would be really helpful if you put your name, affiliation, and your comment and question, because even if we don't get to your question, we get to know what you wanted to know. And that's going to help us later on if we decide to do something with the contents of this session. So to get started here, I want to just say my introduction to history of linguistics was informal. It was Fritz Neumeyer's book, which I probably encountered for the first time late in my graduate career or early thereafter. And that's when that's when a lot of what I had learned in syntax kind of came together for me for the first time, when I understood how all the moving parts were and how we got from the 1960s to where I was in the 1980s, 1990s. My first time teaching history of linguistics was a course in 2001. I taught history and methodology of linguistics. That was about 10 years after I had gotten onto my first tenure track job. I'd gone through tenure and promotion and everything. And I was asked to do this, and I had no idea what I was going to do. No idea whatsoever. But I knew that Fritz Neumeyer taught a course on that, because you did. And I said, what have you got? And you sent me all of your notes and your syllabus and everything else. And there was another fellow at University of South Carolina who also taught a course which went from Panini up to where you started. He stopped in American structuralism. And so this was Donald Cooper, who was a 1971 Slavic linguistics PhD from Harvard, turned himself into a laryngology specialist in communication sciences. But anyway, he taught this because he knew this stuff. And so I went and I took the portfolio of articles that Don Cooper had used and what Fritz sent me, and I tried to patch together a course. And I've been teaching it on and off ever since. But I remark on how this course came to be for me, because number one, it was 15 years after I finished my PhD that I ever was even asked to teach such a course. And I still, 15 years after my PhD, had no idea what to do. So this is trial by fire. So I reached out to Donald Cooper and Fritz Neumeyer. Cooper's semester-long course started with Panini and ended with Sapir. Then he was done. As far as he was concerned, there was no linguistics after that. Fritz's course started with Sapir and ended with LGB. So between those two things, sifting out half a semester out of each of those two full semester courses, I came up with this. And this is sort of a bulleted, this is what we do. And then there's the current issues part isn't even that current anymore, but it was at the time, right? And I think, Fritz, you came to talk to us around that time, and you gave lectures on optimality theory and Chomsky's minimalism, and you also gave lectures on functionalism versus formalism. And that stuff it's wonderful stuff. Still use it, still go back to it today. I make my students read that stuff because it really cut to the core. So now I just want to share with you something about how I've come around over the years, because I've been teaching this, every couple of years, 2-3 years, how to make it relevant. And what I've finally come around to is that for our doctoral students, history of linguistics, every doctoral student has a dissertation to do, and every dissertation has is about something, and every something that a dissertation is about has a history. So basically, you know, we go through history of linguistics the way I designed it, or the way it's designed for me by a couple of people. But my students, my doctoral students, their semester-long project is draft your lit review. You're going to need a lit review. There's a history behind whatever it is you're working on. Go find that out and map out your lit review. So if nothing else, the history of linguistics course fits into our program as here's where you're going to write your lit review, and it moves people along towards completion. And it makes the course relevant and part of training. I think that, and this is just, I'm just going to say this couple more things and then be done. Things I've thought about, what are the prerequisites for teaching history of linguistics? Well, you need breadth of training. I joke about a phonologist should be able to teach phonetics. A syntactician should be able to teach semantics, right? Those kinds of things. I remark about the MIT graduate from in phonology that visited as a finalist when I was on a 1 year in Wisconsin. And I knew this guy, he was kind of an acquaintance, and he came to talk to me after he went to his interview with the search committee. And he said, I don't know, they asked me if I could teach phonetics, and I told them, but I do phonology. He didn't get the job, as you might imagine, you know, but it's that kind of, you know, non-breadth attitude which so many students come away with, which is a barrier to any kind of getting into history of linguistics. Experience, it's not a course you're going to offer your first year out. No one. It's also not a course that most people can devise on their own, I believe, because I couldn't devise it on my own. Just because I couldn't devise it on my own doesn't mean you can't, but my sense is that it's not something that one just figures out. And I had good mentoring, I had good sources, I had good resources, which is why I think we're here. Why this organized session is here, because I think we want to do something to correct that. And then the purpose, I mentioned, you know, lit review chapters for dissertations as being sort of a goal for the course, making the course work for the program, for the students in the program. The course needs to fill a need beyond its own specific content. And I think that's also important. I will make one remark about my travails in trying to develop history of linguistics, and my awareness of history of linguistics played a huge role in a book called Grammar of Raising Control, which was designed not to be a history of linguistics, but designed to be a kind of an upper level syntactic course book, where we focused on raising control. And the sections of the book go through transformational grammar, postals on raising, extended standard theory, Chomsky's conditions, relational grammar, pro-modern postal relational succession law, revised extended standard theory, Chomsky and Lasnik filters and control, government and binding, Hermon's subjecthood and islandhood, and finally minimalism, Lasnik and Saito on subjective infinitives. So this is how, you know, history of linguistics played a huge role in our being able to write a book that took you through the conceptual progress of syntactic theory over the course of a span of about 30, 35 years. And it's a good resource. That's all I have to say. So I'm going to get out of the way, and we're not going to see John Goldsmith, so I'm going to click through. You'll get to see how many slides he had. 31. All right. So okay, John, I'm sorry you're not here. We're just, you know, just the travails. Okay. And now John Joseph.
Okay.
So John Joseph, you don't have as many slides.
I have not.
No. And you can come up here. I'm just going to give you the easiest way to click through these is to just use the arrow key.
Okay.
And then you can back up as you choose, as you please.
Over several decades of interacting with colleagues who teach the history of linguistics, I've come to see us as differing between those who, one, start from the current state of the field and construct a narrative of how we got here. And two, those who instead take some decisive historical moment, which can be at any time between antiquity and the recent past, as the fulcrum of their account of the field's development. And then within one, I have a second division, subtler in nature. It separates those who base 1A based their syllabus on the burning conceptual and methodological issues of the day, reconstructing their genesis and evolution, and 1B, those who focus on the trajectory rather than its endpoints. So approach 1A, which I would call presentist, aligns with faith in steady scientific progress, which, to be sure, most students find appealing. 1B, the trajectorial approach, doesn't question progress, only perhaps the steadiness of progress, and rather than emphasize the brilliance of how we work now, it hopes that the trajectory will point the way to how we work next. As for 2, in calling it heliocentric, I take my cue from the French syntactician Tenière, who analyzed every sentence, even extremely complex ones like this from Bossuet, who we heard about this morning from Danilo, analyzes every sentence as having a single soleil, a single sun, with all the other elements best understood in terms of their relation to it. So this extremely long sentence from Bossuet by Tenière's analysis is all centered on the word conserve, conserves or preserves. And again, as I say, all the other elements are understood in terms of their relationship to the ones next to them, but then ultimately always to conserve. Now, the heliocentric approach, like the trajectorial one, doesn't necessarily deny progress, but neither does it assume its steadiness. Some teaching of the history of linguistics might be characterized as 3 antiquarian, though I've never heard anybody stake a claim to that approach. Yes, I'm an antiquarian and proud of it. Even if teaching the history of, say, Indian or Arabic or Latin linguistics, one would still be likely to cover modern interpretations of the medieval grammars, but there may be people who prefer to stick just to the original ancient and medieval sources. Presentist histories are not hard to find. We'll have a survey coming up from Margaret. But my impression is that you've opened most introductory textbooks. You may find some history of linguistics, some like Baker and Hengeveld 2012, for instance, have none whatsoever. In their index, Sapir and Saussure are the only people born before the 20th century who are in the index, and the whole reference to Saussure is, quote, the arbitrary and conventional character of the word is, according to de Saussure 1916, a basic property of natural language, end quote, which vaguely approaches accuracy. Saussure doesn't make it into the 4th edition of Yule's The Study of Language, 2010, but Sapir is there and joined by Jones and Grimm, plus Broca and Wernicke. In the history section, history of linguistics section of his courses, Ferdinand de Saussure was a trajectorist. Now, in my abstract for the talk today, I originally called him a presentist. I was thinking of the short time span that he credits linguistics with having been through, but I've changed my mind. The course in general linguistics has a short paragraph on grammar as a normative discipline, then a longer one on philology, before Bopp enters with what's called comparative philology. and on then to Grimm and several others, including Max Müller, then Curtius and Schleicher. But the course says, quote, but the comparative school, which had the indisputable merit of opening up a new and fruitful field, did not succeed in setting up the true science of linguistics. It failed to seek out the nature of its object of study, end quote. And that, of course, seeking out the object of study is the prime concern of Saussure's. He says that, quote, not until around 1870 did scholars begin to seek out the principles that govern the life of languages, end quote. That was just 40 years prior to the lecture he was giving. He credits Romance linguistics and Germanic linguistics, with marking, quote, the start of linguistics proper. Then, somewhat disjointedly, he says that, quote, a first impetus was given by the American scholar Whitney, the author of Life and Growth of Language, 1875. And then soon after, the neo-grammarians, led by Saussure's teachers, Osthoff and Bruckmann, with whom he had strained relations. His mentions of Whitney, whom he met in Berlin in 1879, and who in a manuscript he said that he revered, his mentions of Whitney are always preceded by the American. You'd think his name is l'Américain Whitney, and which I suppose was a particular honor because American linguists were so thin on the ground. Saussure was signaling to his students by saying, you know, linguistics only really started around 1870. He was signaling to his students that he himself had been there at the birth of linguistics. And it's noteworthy, too, that he mentions not a single French or Francophone linguist, only Germans, plus Jones and Whitney, the American Whitney. Whitney, by the way, he himself leaves the history of linguistics till the very end of his book, The Life and Growth of Language, where besides most of the names Saussure will cite, he says that, quote, Rask in Denmark, Bionouf in France, and Ascoli in Italy have most rights to be mentioned on the same page with the great German masters, end quote. Yet he believes that, quote, a German science of language cannot be said yet to have an existence, end quote. Linguists remain for him within what he calls comparative philology. Considering that the preceding 300 pages of the book have actually laid out the fullest vision of a modern linguistic science to that date, this is presentism, even if it's in the guise of a sort of futurism. He's saying, no, we still don't have a linguistics, we still don't have a science of language. Chomsky has famously been a heliocentrist, identifying a succession of figures from the distant past as the true founders of linguistic science, whose discoveries radiated light until being wrongly eclipsed by later doctrines. And these earlier sources of light, Chomsky claims to be restoring to their true and rightful place. This briefly included Saussure until Chomsky read Humboldt, who's remained his brightest star before, during, and after Chomsky's focus on the Port-Royal grammarians in Cartesian linguistics. The well-known story of Chomsky's History of Linguistics course being named the bad guys course by students at MIT, a few of whom are in this room with us. That story has its roots in the disputes of the 1960s, so wonderfully chronicled by Randy Harris in the Linguistics Wars. What it suggests is that the fact that they called it the bad guys course, and he didn't like that. It suggests that although designed as heliocentric, Chomsky's course was received by his students as presentist. Neither in law nor in literary studies is textual meaning located solely in authorial intent. It's co-constructed with the text's receivers. I intend my own History of Linguistics course to be trajectorial, though I'm aware that my own research trajectory may incline my students to experience the course as heliocentric. Plato, Saussure, Meillet, Benveniste, Jacobson, and indeed Chomsky all get plenty of attention. And whilst in my mind, you cannot have half a dozen stars in a solar system, students could be forgiven for imagining that Saussure is the center of my linguistic galaxy. The recently published Cambridge History of Linguistics was my first experience of having my trajectorial orientation bump up against the publisher's presentist inclination. CUP made clear that they wanted the book to be weighted toward what we do now. And there are certainly advantages to that in teaching. More students are likely to be engaged by a presentist approach than by others, with the proviso that students will always be more engaged when the teacher is teaching to their natural inclinations and strengths. And that includes antiquarians as well. So if any of you are inclined in the antiquarian direction, I end with this conciliatory shout out to you, or to thee, as you no doubt prefer. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sam Rosenthal. Goals for teaching history of linguistics. Yeah. And you can just use the arrow.
Okay,
It's the easiest way to do it.
Well, I think I just discovered I'm a presentist, so I'll this will be a very presentist discussion. I also did not have a formal background in the teaching history of linguistics, but Steve, I read your book when I was in grad school, The Phonology in the 20th Century, and I used to discuss it with John McCarthy, and it was a lot of fun. Okay, I want to begin by mentioning my unique situation at Oakland University. The history of linguistics class at Oakland is the capstone for the major, and it's also the writing intensive course. So since all seniors are required to take the course, I kind of use this as an opportunity to revisit some important concepts that they've learned. And also some concepts that they might not have been exposed to at all. So one of my goals in a class like this through teaching history is to expose students really to the larger goals of linguistic theory. So it's not necessarily a step-by-step history class. Often what I find with our students is that they're often exposed to larger goals in some other classes, but it's never the primary focus of a syntax class or a phonology class. There's no guarantee they're going to get exposure to the history of linguistics at all. And even when they are looking at historical development of some concepts, let's say the phoneme or the transformations or universal grammar and linguistic relativity, I can take this as an opportunity to really sort of take these concepts that they have and connect them to the bigger picture of linguistics and to other disciplines. And I believe that knowledge of the history of the field can greatly increase the students' understanding of linguistics and inform their work, as we've already heard like Stan was saying before. So a history of linguistics class suffers from many of the same problems that arise from teaching the history of science, I think. Namely, students and departments feel that there are other courses that they ought to take. Many students don't feel there's much value in learning the history of the field when compared to taking, let's say, another theory class. And I think one way to overcome this problem is by carefully considering the goals of a history of linguistics class. Rather than teaching, like I said, just a timeline of linguistic development, the idea that it should be for the students to somehow appreciate what I call the nature of linguistics, which is what I'll define in a couple of minutes. And what I mean, and so to understand the nature of linguistics, they can do this by understanding how linguistics has developed. So like I said before, courses in phonology and syntax are in particular are concerned with teaching theory, and the students are tested by applying the theory to specific problems. The students, as a result, become proficient with the constructs of the theory without necessarily understanding them. And this is a classic problem of not being able to see the forest through the trees. Historical issues will come up, but usually it's to serve as a justification for some kind of change in the theory, not much more than that. And that's hardly, that's hardly a history lesson at all. So like, for example, I might, in a phonology class, I might argue for relative prominence of stress by showing them how the SPE feature theory of stress doesn't handle stress very well and so on. But again, that's hardly very historical. A related problem emerges is that students believe that the theory they're learning is the only theory out there, right? And I think a history class is a good way of overcoming that. And also, a third problem, students also fail to properly understand the concepts that they learn because they're never directly tested on them. So a student, you can ask a student what a phoneme is, and they'll tell you that it's a unit of a sound that enters into a meaning contrast, but this ignores all of the psychological components of its definition and the justification for its definition. So a course in the history of linguistics is an opportunity to examine the development of these concepts and to emphasize their more abstract nature. So like I said, my goal of providing the students with the opportunity to delve deeper into certain concepts is embedded in a larger goal, which I call the nature of linguistics. This is really the only slide that matters from the ones I put up there. And this is based on the concept of the nature of science, which I sort of adapted. Really, I just kind of lifted it completely, I would say, from this reference. There's no single definition of the nature of science, so I'm just going to use this AAAS definition from 1990. And so the main tenets of the nature of linguistics that I try to explore are the following. A science of language is possible, but it cannot answer all the questions pertaining to language. Linguistics is empirically and logically based, but it also allows or involves imagination and inventive explanation. And linguistics should be understood in its philosophical context and its connections to other disciplines. Okay, so, and I think the nature of linguistics naturally emerges from a course in the history of linguistics. It's not possible to discuss the developments in linguistics without discussing the goals of creating a scientific study of language. And in terms of how empirical it is, of course, that comes and goes. By studying, by studying how the field has developed, students understand that linguistics, like a science, is a process and progress. This allows students to consider fundamental issues, which would lead them to question aspects of the syntactic or phonological theories that they've been taught. Students rarely, if ever, see alternative frameworks for syntax or phonology. A course in the history is an opportunity for students to explore alternatives to, minimalism and so on. Just to say, like, because this is the capstone course for our department, one of the possible term papers that I allow students to write would be a comparison between two linguistic theories. Okay, so just a little bit in terms of how I organize my class. As you'll see, it's going to be very presentist. My history of linguistics course is organized in a rather straightforward manner. I begin by discussing Greek views of language and then the Indian and Arabic grammatical traditions. I then go on to the neo-grammarians, European and American structuralism, and then generative grammar. Part of understanding the nature of linguistics is understanding that attempts to develop a science of language do not occur in a vacuum, and that scholars are inspired by ideas from other disciplines. So, for example, Saussure's use of language as a social fact could be related to Durkheim, and Chomsky's use of formal grammar relating to mathematical linguistics. And these can be used, I think, to stimulate discussions of inventive explanations in linguistics. Like I like to say to the students, we cannot be in the room when it happens, but the students should learn to appreciate the kinds of eureka moments that linguists have. And one way I try to teach the class is by trying to look at what was happening before a certain development and the development itself, and try to narrow down the gap as much as possible so students can say that, there's the eureka moment. And again, I mean, obviously we can ask Chomsky what his eureka moment was, but I don't know what it is. There had to have been some leap from formal grammars to transformational generative grammar. Of course, there were other elements mixed in. And at the same time, it's an opportunity for the students to consider how the same premises could have led to other possible outcomes. So a good example of that I like to show the students is following the development of contrast in phonology from Saussure to Jacobson. And today the students, of course, will use distinctive features, but there's also particle phonologies and other things that are out there, and they will get no exposure to it. But seeing how these different theories could have developed from the same premises, I think, is very instructive for students to understand the big picture of linguistics. I make two departures from a typical history class. At one point, when discussing linguistic relativity in the section we do on Sapir, I digress and we read a few chapters from John McWhorter's book, The Language Hoax. Plus, we also discuss some neo-Whorfian research, particularly Leah Boroditsky. Given that linguistic relativity is a contentious issue, it's important to discuss it, obviously, but I don't necessarily resolve the debate. I sort of let the students do what they want with that. So the first 2/3 of the course follows a typical progression through linguistics, and I stop at generative grammar circa 1970. So I'll talk a little bit about the linguistic wars, but I don't really get into it very much. At that point, we turn to some other issues, and we read Chomsky's review of Skinner and spend the rest of the semester examining the principles of Chomsky's linguistic program, that is innateness and universal grammar. And this includes reading Fodor's views on modularity. We don't actually read Fodor, we read something related to someone reviewed Fodor. And the course ends with reading excerpts from Rumelhart and McClellan and Pinker and Prince's reply. And if I can, if there's time, which there rarely is, I'll do a last class or two on optimality theory as a way to sort of understand combining the two views. Discussing universal grammar and its consequences offers an excellent opportunity to discuss different philosophical traditions, which I bring up in class, rationalism and empiricism, and psychological traditions, behaviorism, and the emergence of cognitive psychology that have influenced linguistics. These theories are actually raised at various points throughout the semester. So, for example, it's impossible, I think, to discuss Bloomfield without talking about behaviorism first. I mean, it's so intertwined that at every point I have to stop and say to the class, who here has taken a philosophy class, who has taken a psychology class, and I have all these handouts. I have some examples of what the handouts look like in this slideshow. They're very, very quick handouts. Obviously, you can't do a whole history of behaviorism in 10 minutes, but I really want the students to understand how linguistics is grounded. And just another comment on, like I kind of mentioned this before, just another comment on how I teach my class. I allow a wide range of topics for term papers. The term papers do not need to be strictly historical, although some students like to do that. Students can write papers comparing different theories of grammar or different theories of language, as long as there's some historical context to it. So just as a final note, language, as I like to say, is inextricably linked to the human experience. And like many academic disciplines, we seek to explain it. I'm not aware of any course where broad philosophical claims of linguistics are discussed, at least not in our department. I just don't see it anywhere. And of course, I never experienced it as a student either. So a history class seems the perfect opportunity for this type of discussion through linguistics connections to psychology, philosophy, and anthropology. Students are potentially in a much better position to evaluate not just the particular theories to which they are exposed, but also the whole Chomskyan, generative enterprise and its concomitant claims about the mind. So let me, thank you. Just to sort of show you that that's what my syllabus looks like, and you can see the second half of week 10, we get into mathematical linguistics, and I do discuss formal grammars going back to Hilbert's 1900 challenges for math. And we do one day on Lambeck's categorical phonology. I was very fortunate to take a class with Lambeck at McGill University in 1985. And then we talk about transformational grammar. And again, I don't really go through the whole history of it. I really just sort of concentrate on where the idea came from for Chomsky. And then we do the review of behaviorism and connectionism. And then there's the reading list. And here's just some copies of the handouts and so on. So they're all there for you. So here's my notes on empiricism that I give them, notes on formal language that I give them, and so on. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to invite Margaret Thomas. Have you up for the history of linguistics in American college textbooks? And you can just use the arrow key.
There's actually a paper copy of my handout in the back, so if you're tired of looking at your screens, or you can continue looking at it on your device, whatever.
A little louder, please.
Sure. Okay, so sorry, there's a paper copy of my handout available in addition to the ones on the slides. All right, so my topic is how textbooks that introduce U.S. college students to linguistics represent the history of the field. A course textbook can be a powerful tool for setting forth the scope, goals, and methods of a field to beginners. Olson 1980 goes further, depicting textbooks as, quote, devices for putting ideas and beliefs above criticism. How are U.S. college students oriented to the history of the discipline on their very first exposure to the scientific study of language? That is, when they exit a course like Intro to Linguistics, are they primed to look at linguistic concepts, terms, and issues as having their own life histories, some assembled incrementally, some erupting suddenly, then dropping out of sight, some periodically surfacing and submerging, others sliding laterally into linguistics from adjacent disciplines? Or are students socialized to believe that present-day ideas and beliefs are all that is needed and that are above criticism, thereby blunting their willingness to enroll in a course in the history of linguistics? I approached this question by inspecting 25 textbooks surveying the field of linguistics, published between 1947 and 2021, and directed at the US higher education market. They all presuppose a readership approaching the study of language ab initio. They all address what their authors took to be the core terms, concepts, subfields, and sometimes applications of then contemporary linguistics. By beginning in the middle of the 20th century, I hope to compare representations of the history of the discipline across a 70-year interval. But as it turns out, although authors like Sturtevant and Gleason presented different material to novices and harbored different presuppositions about language compared to scholars writing in the present decade, their incorporation or non-incorporation of historical content differed little. In each of these 25 books listed in one on the handout, by date of first publication, I scrutinized the language authors used in presenting earlier language scholarship. I tried to read between the lines to determine what they implicitly transmitted to readers about its value. I semi-arbitrarily defined earlier language scholarship to mean study of language from at least 30 years before the publication of the text. I also looked for what was not present, that is, for where an author could have but chose not to provide a historical tableau. And I kept in mind that competition for space is always high, forcing authors to privilege certain information over many other candidates. Working through these complexities, I perceived four conventions. Some authors completely or almost completely masked the history of linguistics. Others infused textbooks with short, discontinuous references to it, sparsely or prolifically. Still other authors segregated historical material into a separate section. Finally, a few used the history of linguistics as a basic organizing principle. Since at every step an author can decide to include or exclude historical material, a taxonomy of four discrete categories way oversimplifies what might be better conceived as a scatter plot with four areas of varying density of observation. So an alternative and probably better way to look at this would be to have a scatter plot where you have these four different areas for each text, and then within each text you put a dot in one of those areas. And then at the end of reading the text, you step back and see, well, where are most of the dots situated in this particular text? But I didn't do that. Nevertheless, let me walk you through examples of each of these four semi-autonomous conventions for representing the history of linguistics, given in two on the handout. Okay, so those are the list of the books. First, some textbooks entirely sublimate the history of linguistics. Gleason, 1955, for example, writes at length about the notion of the phoneme, but without acknowledging that the concept had any historical development or faced any challenge. He consistently uses present tense verbs, as if the concept has always existed for all students of language, and that phonemes, like elements in history, in chemistry, are timeless natural phenomena. Likewise, Finnegan, 1989, introduces the International Phonetic Alphabet, again, using strictly present tense verbs, without indicating that it has evolved over more than 130 years since emerging in a specific transnational European context. Finnegan nowhere denies that IPA has a history. He just flattens an intrinsically curved space, diverting readers away from wondering how its past has shaped it. A second convention for representing the history of linguistics is the most common one, namely to weave into a textbook short references to the past, segregated away from the main narrative by, for example, positioning a quotation from an older source as an epigraph at the head of a chapter, or by encasing a historical reference in a sidebar on the margins of a page. This material usually appears without any context or effort to integrate it into the superordinate text, obscuring whatever presupposition the author holds about the relationship of this material to modern ideas. The 6th edition of Fromkin and Rodman's influential textbook provides an example. A subsection entitled Stages in Language Acquisition begins by quoting Augustine's famous recollection of learning to speak. As many have noted, it is a particularly shocking passage without precedent. No one would write about child language learning in this way for a very long time. But Fromkin and Rodman present the passage without any comment or analysis, as if its apparent modernity can be taken for granted. Moreover, their placement of ellipses conceals Augustine's first-person address to God. This is probably an effort to secularize the text for a modern readership, but its effect is to remove another layer of challenge that a modern reader would otherwise confront. By parading Augustine's words past us 21st century readers without context, Fromkin and Rodman avoid having to talk back to these words or even to talk about them. A third convention for representing the history of linguistics in textbooks is to include an independent chapter or section that represents information about the history of the field. In my sample, textbooks that take this approach devote from 2 to 39 pages to the topic. Depressingly, many authors assume a teleological stance that conceives the history of linguistics as a protracted search, which finally culminates in the modern shape of the field. Hughes, 1962, for example, reviews language study in the ancient world, Middle Ages, Renaissance, and then sums up everything that came before 1786 as, quote, centuries of fumbling. One cannot deny that there has been fumbling as scholars wrestle with human language, but fumbling didn't stop in 1786. Worse, textbooks that dedicate a section of the history of to the history of the discipline often undercut their investment. For example, Hudson, 1999, remarks in the introduction to his 500-page text that to accommodate a short semester, quote, no doubt many teachers will choose to omit the chapter on the history of linguistics. Similarly, McGregor's 2nd edition downgrades the value of the 1st edition's section on the history of linguistics by displacing it into the book's companion website. Finally, there is a 4th convention for representing the history of linguistics in textbooks. An author can use it as a basic organizing principle. 2 such books, maybe actually only one, emerged in my sample. Free's 1963 reprints as a monograph, what had been chapter 2 in one of his earlier books, repurposed as an introduction to linguistics. The book's origins therefore distinguish it from the rest of the cohort. Francis Deneen's An Introduction to General Linguistics is squarely a member of this 4th category. It comprises what he calls a, quote, cultural introduction to linguistics. That is, an introduction to the field that infuses historical consciousness at every step. Neither Free's nor Deneen's book, however, was ever reprinted, and neither has had wide influence. In conclusion, textbook authors variously represent earlier language scholarship and orient students variously to the discipline's past. In many instances, historical material has little contextual richness and reflects only current preoccupations. Few authors expose students to contradiction, debate, or rupture in earlier language study, or demonstrate how rarely an idea or observation about language survives and is built upon. But language scholarship encompasses generous numbers of failures and dead ends and rare successes. Its entirety is worth acknowledging and analyzing with students as characteristic of intellectual life. Exposing students to discontinuity and complexity in the history of linguistics would predispose them to better tolerate ambiguity and to accept their own struggles to do meaningful and creative work.
To invite Heather Newell up. And
I'm gonna have two computers.
oh, okay, so this one,
My notes are,
yeah, that's fine.
because I don't print things out. All good.
Okay, okay, okay.
Hi. Hi, everyone. So I want to focus my commentary on two aspects of the teaching of the history of linguistics. And the first main question comes out of the description of this session. It's like, how do we, convince people to take a history of linguistics class? But I think we're focusing a little too much on the students maybe, and we should maybe be focusing a little more on our colleagues, right? Because this is who is in charge of the curriculum. Right? I feel like the students will just take the class. The students like this class, right? But before I go into that, I just want to recap a little bit about what has been said here. And my presentation is going to be a little bit different from everybody else's because I'm the only person speaking who hasn't written a book on the history of linguistics. So I just want to reiterate, right, what Sam and Margaret were saying, that like this is an insanely important part of a linguistics education for students who want to go on and do linguistics, right? If you just want to learn what linguistics is and what a phoneme is and what bare phrase structure is, then that's fine. But if you want to go on and do linguistics, it's really important to be able to situate yourself, right, in the vast sea of theoretical possibilities. And one of these kind of bring it back into the curriculum formation. Right? If we see that there's not a lot of history of linguistics in introductory textbooks, I wonder if there's an interplay here, because in the little bit of research that I've done that I'll show you in a second, an introductory textbook is used to introduce students to things that they will learn in the upper level courses. And if there is no history of linguistics in a department's program, then the people who are teaching introduction to linguistics are not going to focus on history of linguistics, because that's not the helpful part for the students. And then I want to talk a little bit about the focus and the challenges, right, and the people that we talk about in a history of linguistics course, because a lot of times I think we've seen in a couple of the talks that the history of linguistics stops in the 70s, right? And that now is, 50 years ago more. And I feel like some of the students are maybe missing their own representation, and there's a lot more of a varied representation in linguistics in the last half century that would be beneficial for the students to see. So just a little note here. So I looked at all of the linguistics programs in Canada, because I'm Canadian and work at a Canadian university. I looked at in departments where there is a linguistics department that might possibly benefit from a history of linguistics course, how many of them actually have one? And there are around 22 universities with appropriate linguistics programs. Side note, right, for the Americans, Canada has around 10% of the population of the United States, and this is around 10% of the number of linguistics programs. So I don't know if the ratio of departments that have a history of linguistics course is the same in the United States, but it might be. So 6 of these 22 universities have a history of linguistics course, and only 2 of them require it, including mine. right, which is UQAM. The two universities that require a history of linguistics class are French universities, Francophone universities, the University of Quebec at Montreal and University of Laval, right? And then we have a couple other universities. Each of them have different prerequisites. I think UQAM's history of linguistics class is like an introductory course. It requires only introduction to linguistics as a prerequisite. I think that's a little too early. All of the other ones require at least phonetics, or sorry, phonology and syntax, and some of them require more, but there are only 6 of them. And one of the things that I've noted, I've done an informal survey of what I've called my generation, which is, you know, people in their 40s and 50s, maybe 30s, I don't know, right? And virtually none of us had a history of linguistics course. And this kind of echoes a couple of comments in the previous presentations where like, why is it so hard for us to build a history of linguistics course? Because we haven't had one, right? Because it hasn't been part of our education, right? So I have taught this course and I think it's a very important course, but actually the course at UQAM, which is one of the only required history of linguistics courses in Canada, might be on the chopping block because we're doing a program reform. And so one of the questions I have for this room of preaching to the choir, right, is how do I convince my colleagues not to cut this course, right? So my colleagues are saying, well, what about a typology course? What about a historical linguistics course? We don't have those either. Right? Is history of linguistics more important than these other things that we could be teaching the students? And I think it is, but I think there are arguments for other courses as well. So I do think that it's a colleague issue and not necessarily a student issue when we're trying to convince people to give history of linguistics courses. And so just going on to make a couple of more points, Margaret's talk is really interesting, right? You're like, why isn't there a lot more history of linguistics in the introductory textbooks? And I actually meant to go look, but I didn't have time to go look at other introductory, like Introduction to Physics. How much history of physics is in an Introduction to Physics book? I don't know, but I did go through and look at least UQAM and McGill, which are 2 universities in Montreal that I have relationships with. And a lot of the sciences do have history of, history of philosophy, history of logic, history of science, history of psychology courses, right? So there is an argument from what's going on in other departments, right, that this is an important thing to teach. But one thing I found when I was trying to work on a history of linguistics course is that we don't really have any, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm probably the newest person at this in this room. We don't really have a lot of good history of linguistics textbooks. We have a lot of good material on the history of linguistics, a lot of it written by people in this room, right? But there are very few books, except for maybe like the short history of linguistics, right? Is around 250 pages, right? You get something like Battle in the Minefields, which we didn't really get to talk about, which in its printed form is over 1,000 pages long, and it's just the first volume, right? Like, this is not a one class book, right? And so you're going and you're finding different materials from different places, and that's one of the things that makes it a lot of work. So it might be easier to convince departments to have this class if we could just give them a resource. So I'm asking all of you, because I'm not the expert, but it would be really nice. Between then and now, like, we have this kind of course pack kind of view of the course. And for me, right, I'm actually kind of lucky because there's a lot of material on the history of linguistics that is translated into French, right? But it's harder to make a translated into French course pack that is where all the different parts are at the same level than it is to just give a textbook, which is just a problem in Francophone universities, I find anyway, right? We don't have textbooks. I'm actually starting to write with colleagues an intro to linguistics in French, because there really aren't very many of those and not very many that are appropriate. And now I have to keep in mind the extra bit about how much history of linguistics are we going to put in our introductory textbook. So like I said, I think we need to make it easier for the people who are in charge of curricula to teach these courses because a lot of them haven't had it. And so a lot of them don't see the utility. And then if it's also hard to teach this class, then it's just, there's a lot of barriers. And then I just have a little list here of like things that we have agreed should be in here, right? Like what's our genealogy? What are the battles? I come from a department where you have a lot of what we call functionalists and formalists, right? So the students see the battle, but they don't know without a history of linguistics class why mommy and daddy are fighting, right? They just think it's our department, and it's not our department. It's literally the history of linguistics at work in the present day. But one thing that I came up against, I taught this class with a colleague, and we started going through the antiquity to minimalism kind of course plan. And I went, Richard, we literally can't do an old white dude class, right? Like kids these days, you give them this syllabus and they're going to be like, no, we do not want this class. Like that's one of the things that the students will not want. And so we talked about it while we talked through the class, and a lot of the textbooks and a lot of the work that everybody's done does like weave this in a bit. But even I think in the short history of linguistics, the first edition, I think there are some new chapters, and I haven't read them in the newest edition, but in the intro to this book, it said something like, oh, I know that there are a lot of people that were missing and a lot of perspectives were missing, but I'm not an expert on that. And hopefully somebody will do something about it. But I've tried to weave things in. And then in the chapter of history in the last century, there was no reference to anyone that wasn't a European or American white man, right? And so this kind of thing, I think we need to figure a way to decenter that. Like the actual history is a whole bunch of white men because of many sociological reasons, some of which Margaret was talking about in her plenary. But I do feel like if we focus a little bit more on recent history, we might be able to get the kids a little more excited about this. And I have a couple other little comments there, but it's not really important. So one thing I wonder is like, so maybe we can talk about it, is what can we do to get more people on board with teaching the history of linguistics? Who should we be campaigning to? I looked at the LSA Summer Institutes, right? And in the last decade, there's been one history of linguistics course offered. Right? And there are lots of other disciplines like phonology and syntax, like introduction to phonology, introduction to syntax, that go every year. Right? So is that something that we should be doing a little more? And yeah, how can we help the current professors who don't have a background in history of linguistics get excited about teaching the history of linguistics? So that's it. Those are my comments.
Ask Steve Anderson to come up and present.
Okay, so you say it's
I will.
arrow key.
The arrow
Yes.
key, there we go.
Okay. Dan's comment about the history of linguistics course that ended with Sapir reminded me that when I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, the required course in world history ended with the French Revolution. I am quite in sympathy with the comments Heather was making. In fact, I think some of the background for this symposium or workshop or whatever we're calling it was in fact the observation that the offering and requiring of history of linguistics courses has massively declined over the years. I mean, certainly when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student and on into the 80s and so on, history of linguistics courses were offered everywhere and they were typically required. I mean, every place I studied, I was required to take a course in the history of linguistics. But when you look around now, you look at what count as the major departments of linguistics, and I apologize for slighting others, but when you look at the offerings at MIT, Harvard, Yale, University of Chicago, Berkeley, UCLA. I think these are all places that once had history of linguistics courses and now don't have any courses. I mean, there are, and you know, there are people in this room who teach such courses at other universities, but it's sad to say that the teaching of history of linguistics has declined. One big reason I think that Heather pointed to is the fact that many current faculty never had such a course. And so even if they had any interest in teaching it, they don't feel that they have any competence at it. Well, okay, that's, I don't really have anything to say about how we should encourage more programs to include courses on the history of linguistics. I'm going to confine my attention to content and goals. The presentations we've had are largely devoted to how to organize and encourage courses that will provide a comprehensive theory, a comprehensive history of our field, exposing students both to its internal development and to its connections with other domains of inquiry. In some, perhaps many cases, these are designed to provide background on linguistics to students who will focus on some area other than theory, maybe psycholinguistics or sociolinguistics or speech therapy or various other things. Often, the courses are focused on undergraduates who are comparatively new to the field or beginning graduate students, that is, people who are not at that time actively involved in research on theoretical issues in linguistics. Exposing these students to the broad history of the field in a single term, as is generally the case, I don't know that there's any place where there's a year-long history of linguistics sequence. It's necessarily hard for a class like that to develop a complete view of any of the positions discussed. There's just too much to cover. So in Sam Rosenthal's syllabus, for instance, generally there's only 1 or 2 hours of class devoted to any given topic. And to get from the Greeks to optimality theory in 15 weeks, depth inevitably has to be sacrificed. Given the huge number, you guys didn't get to appreciate all of John Goldsmith's slides, but the huge number of names and diverse agendas of the figures in his charts, students might be able to internalize some of the networks of influence. But as for understanding what it means to say that linguist A was influenced by or came to influence psychologist B, that's pretty unlikely unless the students already knew quite a lot. I don't mean to suggest that this sort of course doesn't have a role to play in linguistics programs. For one thing, more students take linguistics courses, at least at an introductory level, then will eventually focus on theoretical work. And it's worthwhile for many of them to have some background on what linguistics is and how it came to be, and not simply an exposure to current concepts and methodologies. Let's see, my own experience, as I say, I was always required to take history courses. In my own academic history, I can recall 3 courses in the history of linguistics. First, as an undergraduate, studying with a hardcore descriptivist, I had a reading course assigned as a way to understand the history. Let's see. We read Sapir's language, Bloomfield's, this was a tiny group. I mean, I was the only one doing this. I read Sapir's language, Bloomfield's language, Saussure's cours, which I was told to read in the English version. Trubetskoy's Grundzüge, which I read in the French, fortunately, since I think the French is better than the German original. Book by Henry Hönigswald on historical methodology in structuralist terms, and Hjelmslöv's Prolegomena. I think I learned something, although not a lot, from all of these, with the single exception of the Yomsler, which made absolutely no sense to me. I have the impression that in spite of the many praises it received from descriptivists, my reaction was pretty general. That is, one sees lots of descriptivists claim, oh, Yomsler is wonderful, but this was more an appreciation of the fact that he was impenetrably formalist. The things that he actually had to say had no influence on the field, as far as I could tell, outside Denmark. Then at the 1966 Linguistic Institute, I took a course in the history of linguistics from John Lyons, which I found extremely enjoyable. This was a course that covered history from the Greeks to the present day. And while I can say I learned a lot about the overall trajectory of the field, and in fact, I liked that course enough that I felt when I went to MIT, what I wanted to do was something in history of linguistics. I can't say it greatly deepened my appreciation of the views of any of the individual scholars we discussed. At MIT, I took the so-called bad guys course. Now, it's interesting from conversations with Barbara, I can see that probably that course underwent a rapid evolution through John Joseph's approaches. That is, Chomsky seems to have taught it in a heliocentric way, focusing on the enormous insight of earlier people, some specific earlier people, and how that had been obscured and so on and so forth. It was then taken over by Paul Postal. I don't know anyone who was in that course, but I think anyone who has read his Aspects of Phonological Theory book will know what that course was like. That was emphatically a presentist presentation. And that was, I think that offering of the course almost certainly was the central rationale for calling it bad guys. I mean, Postal really was out to get the bad guys. When I took it, there was another Paul Kiparski. It was somewhat more focused, running from Sapir through Bloomfield, Trubetskoy, Jakobson to Harris and early Chomsky, mostly concentrated on phonology and on our coming to understand what the people talked about were trying to do. That was, his goal was not, Paul's goal was not to show us how they had it wrong, or how what they did was sort of John the Baptist to current work. He really wanted us to, he wanted us to read things with the goal of understanding what these people were trying to do and how they went about trying to do it. This was quite different from the other courses, shorter in coverage, but very different in the extent to which one was exposed to what earlier scholars were really trying to do. Okay. So for programs enrolling graduate students and some advanced undergraduates who will be actively engaged in developing theories of phonology, syntax, semantics, I think there's a quite fundamental role to be played by a history course of a somewhat different sort, a course that focuses on helping them to understand where their present preoccupations have come from, how the field has come to have the character it does, but with enough depth to hopefully realize that. Sorry, skipping through things. That involves a variety of things that are difficult to cover in the standard comprehensive survey. So for instance, students need to learn how their predecessors, based on very different presumptions, dealt with much the same problems they address today. For instance, a number of earlier linguists, that is, pre-1960, uncovered states of affairs structurally just like those that motivated Halley's famous argument against phonemics from Russian voicing assimilation. Some of these names are here. They realize the significance of such examples. They all point out the fact that asymmetries in contrast in the output of a phonological regularity is a problem for phonemics. But they took very different conclusions from that. So Bloch, for instance, looking at a similar case in American English, concluded that having shown that sometimes the result of vowel lengthening was contrastive and sometimes it wasn't, meant that we had to treat some long vowels as phonemic and others not, thus violating the lovely symmetry of the apparent system. But he said, phonemic theory has saved us from this mistaken impression. Okay, well, so he took that in one way. Bloomfield, confronting such a thing in Menominee, figured, well, that can't be true given phonemics, so I have to be able to find some evidence that the apparently non-contrastive things really are contrastive, and he brings in loan words and exclamations and so on to prove that the vowels in question really are contrastive, even though they aren't. Interestingly, Hamp, confronting such a situation in Celtic, concludes, well, what we really need to do is pay more attention to morphophonemics. But nobody listened to him. And in fact, the paper is incredibly hard to read. Okay, so that's one example. Another example is the work of Firth and the British prosodic analysts who addressed, I mean, the facts here are quite similar, sometimes identical to ones approached under the rubric of autosegmental phonology, but approached on quite a different basis. Here, I found it a bit puzzling that for the hundreds and hundreds of names on John Goldsmith's networks, Firth didn't show up. When one would think that he would be particularly sensitive to that. Okay, anyway, so one kind of thing that we need our students to come to understand is the way a given set of facts doesn't wear its analysis on its sleeve, and different people confronting exactly the same logic problem come to different conclusions on the basis of a framework, but they have to understand those frameworks in order to pick that up. Another thing one of my hobby horses, something that people need to learn from the history of linguistics is the range of concepts we have currently that we've taken over from earlier work without really examining, and we continue to use them. So again, for me, the canonical example is the structuralist morpheme, which came to have the form it did in descriptivist terms, modeled on the phoneme. Phonemes were units of contrast concatenated to make utterances. On that model, morphemes were units of content concatenated to form words, nicely parallel. The analysis of phonemics broke out into two parts, the study of allophones and the study of phonotactics. Well, okay, we can have allomorphy and morphotactics. And furthermore, in the earlier years, and this is a point of view that persists to some extent, well, that meant we didn't have anything to say specifically in morphology, because the stuff about allomorphy, well, that's all phonology. And the stuff about morphotactics is just syntax. Okay, well, why did the structuralists take the point of view they did? Well, largely because they thought of the phoneme as a really major intellectual accomplishment. And so looking at other data, having that modeled on the same picture of this enormous intellectual accomplishment, the understanding the phoneme, just seemed like common sense. The abandonment of that picture of phonological structure, though, ought to result in a re-examination of the nature of morphemes, something that would be aided by a better sense of the history that had led in both cases to the constructions that evolved. Another example, and I won't go on forever, is the role of Jakobson's replacement. I mean, when we look at Trubetskoy gives a rather extensive typology of oppositions. There are a variety of kinds of oppositions. But Jakobson replaces that with the notion that features have to be strictly binary. And we inherit that to the extent that we still believe in anything like the set of distinctive features that Jakobson, Font, and Holly promulgated, and subsequently in SPE. Binary features really originated as a limitation on phonological dimensions of contrast because of Jakobson's fascination with information theory. If you can represent everything in strictly binary terms, then there's a nice way to measure the amount of information someplace. And Jakobson was really impressed with that. And that, I think, is a major reason he said that. Well, we are perhaps a little bit less impressed with information theory in that sense today. And that ought to lead to a re-examination of what we think dimensions of phonological contrast can be. Okay, well, we get to the advertisement. Everybody gets to advertise their book, right? I think that at the graduate level, there's a place for history courses that are more narrowly focused and integrated into the curriculum of particular aspects of linguistic theory. So a history of phonology course ought, it seems to me, to form a natural part of the study of somebody who's going to be a phonological theorist, likewise in syntax and so on. I guess my model for a course of this sort is this book, Phonology in the 20th Century, of which the second edition, revised and enlarged with lots of pictures, by the way, some of which have never appeared anywhere else. I have a picture of the young Whitney, which was picked up at a garage sale in New Haven, which, as far as I know, hasn't ever been published anywhere else. Okay, fine, get the book. Get the book, it's free, right? Not everybody realizes that Language Science Press is the major publisher in our field of open access monographs. Everything they publish is available in PDF, at least, for free. You can get a printed copy if you like. In fact, you can buy one at the auction tomorrow.
Bid for one.
Hmm?
Bid for it.
Bid for it. But, okay, that's one model for a phonology course. There are surely others. Similar things should be done for syntax and probably semantics, but I'm not the one to design those. I just want to put in a plug for somewhat narrower but deeper courses in the history of linguistics as part of graduate education. These could be either presentist or trajectorial in terms of John Joseph's typology. Personally, I favor the trajectorial, and I think you'll see that this book works that way, to the extent I can keep them apart. But something of the sort would seem to be important to the development of serious theoretical positions. I've taught courses like this at UCLA, at Stanford, at Yale. And while I can't say that students were uniformly enthusiastic, in fact, the last time I offered such a course at Yale as one option for things that something I might teach, nobody wanted to take it. I do think their education would have benefited, as did that of students before them. Other more charismatic teachers might have better luck if they tried. And again, back to Heather's remark about how it's the faculty that are the lever that needs to be moved. Thank you.
Kind of, are we out of time? Are we not? Yeah,
Sorry.
that's okay. I mean, well, what I'd like to do, since we don't have time, I'm going to display the chat so that it becomes part of the recording. Because we've got some comments from Margaret, from this is for Heather, another comment from Margaret to Heather, another comment from John Joseph with a link in there, from Matthew Larity. Are you here? Yeah, from Westchester University in Pennsylvania. A question for John Joseph, and question from Margaret Thomas to everyone about linguistic institutes and proposing to have a course on history of linguistics, and a comment back from John Joseph to Heather. What I'd like to just do here is, since we don't have time and we're done in a second, yeah, we just hit 2:30, 1:30. I want to, since we have it recorded, I'm going to grab the chat. We can preserve the recording, we can make it available. And what I would suggest is that if people have questions, maybe they can email you, Raul, and push those questions through him to us. I'm hoping that this organized session will lead to something in language which will, provide some guidance, some reflections on teaching history of linguistics, and also possibly some online resources which would be useful to people. I know I have a syllabus that I'm happy to share with anyone who wants it. I think that other people in this room may have resources that they would like to share, and we can generate some perhaps enthusiasm and some possible pathways, because I think you could be enthusiastic about teaching history of linguistics, but if you don't know how to go about doing it or how to get started, it's overwhelming as a proposition. So we'll do that. And that's president and at NAAHoLS.org. You can just write to president@NAAHoLS.org, and we'll take it from there, because I don't think this is just an hour and a half. This is the first hour and a half of the work that we need to do. Okay, so thank you all for coming.
And at this point, we have a 15-minute break, and we will continue in this room at 1:45.
Raul?
I'll keep I'd like to.
Raul, how do you get the recording, or do I have it? I started the recording. I can stop it, but how do I get it how do I save it?
It'll say, and it'll be,